You're very welcome. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you all here today to this debate on the preamble of the Irish Constitution on behalf of the Irish Christian Lawyers Fellowship. We're a group of lawyers in Ireland, and we meet every second week on Zoom, and we also organise events such as this and social events. And I'd also like to extend a warm invitation to our end-of-year social event on the 27th of July from 1 to 2 at the Copper Alley Bistro, so please do come along. Just a few brief remarks on why we wanted to hold this debate before I hand over to our chair. In 1999, the Constitutional Review Group described the preamble of the Irish Constitution as objectionable to many in Ireland at that time. And of course, we'll be focusing on the references to God in the preamble, and the preamble explicitly states that all authority derives from the most Holy Trinity, and it also recognizes the divinity and the lordship of Jesus Christ. And now the person of Jesus has been one of controversy for many years, so it's not surprising that these statements are objectionable or offensive to many in Ireland. It's interesting to consider that inside of every courtroom in Ireland, there's a book upon which individuals swear an oath, and parts of that book were compiled by followers of Jesus who made various claims that he, in fact, claimed to be equal to God and had the power to forgive sins, that he had risen from the dead and appeared to them, and that he was the means of reconciliation between God and man. And so, considering the magnitude of these claims, it's not surprising that the endorsement of his divinity and lordship in our preamble would be objectionable to many in Ireland today. To those who believe in these claims, of course, the preamble is a thing of celebration, but considering that many in Ireland do not hold these views, what is the future of our preamble? And so I hand it over to our chair to open the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. You're all welcome. And just thinking, it's coming towards the end of term, so we're all a bit frazzled. And maybe just to set the scene, I was reading that great legal scholar last night, Cole Porter, and he describes himself in one move as being bewitched, bothered and bewildered. And probably a lot of us feel like that, being the end of term, promises made, deadlines missed, but there's another term ahead. And this CPD is rather unusual. We generally tend to, where we're having CPDs, we focus on an area of law, particular development, and we usually come away with a few ideas. I think this particular session will give us food for thought. Will inject something into our minds that we'll have to think about. And I must say, when Brendan first mentioned this as a subject to me, I was kind of envious. It's a feature of my life that I say time and time again, why didn't I think of that? Well, I never thought about that. And generally when we talk about the Constitution, we talk about particular articles or how they interplay. So well done to the organisers, A, for the topic, and B, for gathering together an array of insightful, reflective and interesting speakers. Just to put it in context, what the preamble says, it says, "In the name of the most Holy Trinity, from whom is all authority, and to whom, as our final end, all actions, both of men and states, must be referred, we, the people of Eire, humbly acknowledging all our obligations to our divine Lord Jesus Christ, who sustained our fathers through centuries of trial, gratefully remembering their heroic and unremitting struggle to regain the rightful independence of our nation, and seeking to promote the common good and due observance of prudence, justice and charity, so that the dignity and freedom of the individual may be assured, true social order attained, the unity of our country restored, and concord established with other nations, do hereby adopt and enact and give ourselves this Constitution." Our first speaker is Patrick Treacy, Senior Counsel. He's a colleague. He has many interesting insights and observations, and I will just hand you over to him. Many thanks.
Good afternoon. Just a health warning to begin with. I never met James before in my life until 5 minutes ago, so the endorsement that I have many interesting insights and observations is not based on anything that is factually correct or based on any experience at all. But I'm delighted to be here and delighted to have the invitation to speak to you for 15 or 20 minutes on this subject before the two real heavyweights speak. I'm just the rather modest collegiate warm-up act before David Quinn and Liam Herrick both speak to you. Now, when I was just reflecting on this topic, I came across a quotation recently which I felt is very important to this particular discussion, which incidentally is not a new discussion. This is an issue which the Progressive Democrats many years ago actually put out in the public square. I can remember very particularly at an Ardesh of the Progressive Democrats many, many years ago, it was suggested that any references to God should be removed from the Constitution, and it went down very badly in the general polling and electorate, and it was immediately forgotten about until this debate has resurrected that particular issue. But there is a quotation which I came across recently which for me captures the contention which I want to make to you this afternoon, which is that the preamble should be left exactly the way it is. You will be hearing, no doubt, from my two new friends, much more subtle and sophisticated arguments as to what should be done to amend the Constitution. There's nothing subtle or sophisticated about what I'm saying. I'm going to be suggesting to you that it should be left exactly the way it is. And the quotation which I want to begin with is a quotation from an English philosopher who died a few years ago. Many of you will have heard of him. He is Roger Scruton. And in one of his books, there's very affirming nods already, which are calming my preamble nerves here at this stage. But what Roger Scruton said in the book, one of his many books, but in his book, Rousseau and the Origins of Liberalism, he captured in one sentence the argument which I want to put before you, before my two friends speak. And that sentence is as follows. We must strive to be worthy of an inheritance that we did not create, and to amend it only when we have first understood it. Now, what I want to do, and I'll repeat that quotation at the very end, and hopefully it'll be self-evident, the veracity of that quotation. But what I want to do is, I want to set out for you why I'm arguing that the preamble should be left exactly the way it is. But I want to do so not based on any legal argument, which no doubt Liam will refer to, or any political argument, which I anticipate David will refer to. I want to do it by reference to theological argument, because we are here today with a group of Christian lawyers in fellowship, which is a wonderful initiative and something I feel very privileged to speak at today. And when I say I want to approach this from a theological perspective, I want to specifically look at the three persons of the Trinity. Specifically and realistically look at what do the three persons of the Trinity actually say to the identity of a nation state, to how a nation state can develop, to how a nation state can truly care for its citizens. And I want to suggest to you that there's specific characteristics of each of the three persons of the Trinity, which is the essence of the declaration of God in the preamble, which actually put forward an irresistibly and incomparably attractive vision of what a nation state can be, which in turn means don't change it unless you first understand it, and when you first understand it, it's not worth changing. Now, the first of these three qualities or three persons that I want to reflect on is obviously the Father, but I specifically want to say something about the meaning of the first person of the Trinity for the identity of a nation state. And the characteristic of the Father that is particularly applicable to a nation state is the value of memory. The whole idea of the patriarch or the father figure is the preservation of tradition and the preservation of memory. And one of the great problems we have in secularist culture at this time is the erasure of memory. So what the first person of the Trinity, the idea of the Father, holds is inheritance, lineage, tradition, succession, history, and memory. And one of the worrying aspects about erasing the preamble and erasing Christian identity and the preliminary statement of Christian identity in the Constitution is that it entails an erasure of memory. It entails the removal of our remembering, re-embodying of our actual history as a Christian people. And obviously, one can look at 1600 years of Christian tradition to say that this is what's being erased. But I just want to give you just one example of this as to why our memory as a Christian people, which is really what the Father stands for in the context of a nation state, is so important. And that is by remembering or bringing into memory something which I regard and which many people regard as profoundly inspirational in our history. And that is the memory of Irish monasticism, particularly in the 6th century, the 7th century, and the 8th century. And in particular, how Irish monasticism at that time, when we see examples of the monastic communities in the Skellig, and we see examples of how monastic life was lived at that time, that is one aspect of it. But another aspect of it is through the work of Columba, or Columbanus, and how the Irish memory of Christian heritage was so vital in the preservation and enhancement of European civilization through Irish monastic work in both Britain and in the continent. And one very beautiful and important book that has come out in the last few years is Tom Holland's book, Dominion. And he in that book he's a beautiful writer, of course, but he gives an amazing description of the memory and the importance of Irish monasticism in that book. And I want to read out to you two quotations from that book, which capture in a much more beautiful way than I could why Irish monasticism at that time is so valuable and so important in our national memory. He says, "It was certain that some monks, taking to the treacherous waters of the Atlantic, had made landfall on a jagged spike of rock, or skellig, as it was called in the local language, and there lived in bare cells. Cold and hunger, which kings built while kings built great feasting halls to keep at bay, were valued by those who settled on Skellig as pathways to the radiant presence of God. Monks who knelt for hours in sheeting rain or laboured on empty stomachs at tasks properly suited to slaves did so in the hope of transcending the limitations of the fallen world. The veil that separated the heavenly from the earthly seems to their admirers almost parted by their efforts. Mortal men, so people believed, were living the lives of angels. Nowhere else in the Christian West were saints quite as tough, quite as manifestly holy as they were in Ireland." So there's another quotation which I won't repeat because of time, but the first aspect of why placing the Trinity at the beginning of the Constitution is that it's a statement of how important it is to remember, to cherish our memory, our Irish heritage, our Christian heritage, and in particular the incalculably important contribution which Irish monasticism has made to European civilization. Now, the second reason I'm suggesting that it's left exactly the way it is, so the message is very clear, is by reference to the second person of the Trinity, the Son. And as James pointed out when he read the Constitution, it's not just simply a reference to the Trinity at the start of the preamble. There's a specific enunciation of the name of Jesus Christ, or our Lord Jesus Christ, which could not be more central or explicit in the preamble. And the reason why the reference to the Son, to Jesus Christ, is so important is because it underwrites the second value I want to mention after memory. And that second value is human dignity. In fact, I know Liam will be addressing this in his own presentation. The Irish Constitution was radically innovative. This is a point which Samuel Moyne, a professor in Harvard University, has brought out, because it was the first constitutional document that actually makes explicit reference to the term of human dignity and, in fact, enunciates in a constitutional document the understanding of human rights, or fundamental rights, as it's termed in Articles 40 to 44. So the reference to human dignity in the preamble is entirely innovative. But what needs to be understood is that it's a reference to human dignity which is grounded in the person of Jesus Christ. It's grounded in the second person of the Trinity. And that reference to human dignity is specific in its emergence from the Judeo-Christian tradition, because in the Jewish tradition, which of course Christianity then emerges from, we have in the book of Genesis the fundamental principle that the human person is made in the image and likeness of God. And the human person then being made in the image and likeness of God, from the Christian perspective, reaches its totality or its final fulfillment in the person of Jesus Christ, who is human and divine. And it is this incarnation or realization of the totality of the human person in Jesus Christ, which is the epitome of human dignity, which no totalitarian regime, which no state control, which no governmental action can actually be allowed to violate in accordance with human dignity and the provisions in our Constitution. And while human rights discourse has taken on such a strong emphasis since the Second World War and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, it can often be forgotten that the origin of human rights, theologically and philosophy, I would say, incomparably comes from the Jewish Christian tradition, from the book of Genesis and the person of Jesus Christ. But historically, it would seem that the first reference to human rights was actually made again in the Christian context. And it comes from a Spanish colonist called Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a Spanish colonist who went to the West Indies. And in 1514, he had a Damascus conversion over the manner in which he was treating in what is now known as the West Indies, how the Indians were actually being treated by him. And freeing his slaves, he devoted himself to defending the Indians from tyranny. And he argued that every human being has been made equally by God and endowed by God with the same spark of reason. He wrote and spoke that all the peoples of the world are humans, and there's only one definition of all humans and of each one, is that they are rational. But what he specifically said, this is in 1514, he stated that every mortal, Christian or not, has derived rights from God, and he termed those rights human rights. So human rights, not just theologically or philosophically, can be grounded in the Jewish Christian tradition. They're historically grounded in the Christian tradition through the words and the bravery and the actions of him as effectively the father of abolitionism of slavery going back to 1514. So when we talk about the second person of the Trinity, we're talking about human dignity, and we're talking about the specific role of Jesus Christ as the exemplar of human dignity. But the reason why I want to emphasize the importance of the second person and human dignity is for a different reason. It's not because of human rights, and indeed I completely accept that my two fellow speakers are far more schooled in that vast and increasingly important subject than I am. But I want to suggest the importance of it to our nation state for a different reason. And the different reason why human dignity is so important, as underwritten by the Christian tradition, is in education. Because our understanding of education is becoming increasingly technocratic, or if I can put it, reductionist. In other words, we see the role of education as effectively producing productive students, producing people who produce, who work, who are technocrats, who achieve, who have, who consume. And it's not an understanding of education which is based on the inherent, inalienable dignity of the human person. And if we wish to develop an education system which is not based on outcomes, but is based on a person being truly who they are and have the potential to be, the preservation of the importance of human dignity as underwritten by the person of Jesus Christ is, in my view, of inestimable importance. Each of us come from God, each of us return to God, and each of us are here for God. And that is why in the Constitution, when it begins by stating that all authority comes from the Trinity and all authority returns to the Trinity, it expresses a view of what the human person is meant to be. It expresses a view of education. It expresses a view that a person has got this human dignity because a person belongs to God, a person returns to God. And when a person realizes his or her God-given potential, it is when they act in accordance with the gift of life given to them by God. So that emphasis on the second person I want to stress of human dignity, particularly in the context of what education is meant to be. And the third reason why I'm arguing for the continuation, exactly as it is, of the emphasis, the primary emphasis on the Trinity and on the person of Jesus Christ in the preamble, is by reference to the third person in the Trinity, the Holy Spirit. And in particular, why I emphasize the Holy Spirit is that while the first person gives us the emphasis on memory, and the second person gives us the emphasis on human dignity, the third person gives us the emphasis on vision, on the importance of having a public life which is inspired, which is prophetic, which opens up new vistas, which engages people, which connects at the level of the heart, which makes people feel profoundly committed and engaged in public life. And unfortunately, in our public life at the moment, there is a stifling uniformity. You may often see people suggesting that they radically disagree, but really, actually, they uniformly agree. And the uniform agreement is that in secularist debate, any reference to God, any reference to religion, any reference to transcendent values based on a belief in God is to be dismissed from public life. It's to be treated as something which is right-wing, which is reactionary, which is not based on the use of one's intellect or logic. And the effect of that is, of course, that when you take religion out of the public square, it isn't the case that what's left is neutral, because the secularist perspective is not neutral. The secularist perspective itself is a particularly ideologically driven position. And that position is that when we discuss what's best for a country, what's best for its citizens, religion is to have no place. It has no relevance. It has nothing to say that is actually life-changing or definitive in a discussion of any particular area of public debate. So the third person of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit, reminds us of the importance of public life, which is inspirational, which is multifaceted, where people engage freely and frankly based on religious conviction and are not treated as in some way deficient or ignorant or regressive by virtue of the fact that they speak in the public square from a position that is based on God. Now, by way of conclusion, to bring all that together, when we bring these virtues of memory and dignity and vision together, when we bring the three persons of the Trinity together, and when we acknowledge them as the central ground upon which we interpret, not so much interpret, but the central ground upon which we bring into place our Constitution, we do something at a much more profound level, and it's this. We enter publicly as a nation into the relationship of the persons with the Trinity. Because in Christian theology, the Trinity isn't some abstract, removed theological entity that we obliquely consider or speak about. The Trinity is meant in Christian theology and Christian life to be a lived reality that embraces us in a love which transcends all knowledge and which is permanently available to us. And what that means, not so much from a perspective of spirituality, but what it means in terms of a country, is that it addresses a fundamental problem which I believe this country has, which never actually gets expressed, although the fact that it's not expressed proves that we have this problem. And it's a problem which Pope Francis has repeatedly referred to, particularly in 2014 and in 2015 and in 2016 in his pontificate. And it is this idea of ideological colonization. It's the idea that a country can actually be overwhelmed by a particular way of thinking and not actually be aware that it has been caught into a particular way of thinking. And what he means by ideological colonization is effectively this, that with ideological colonization, a country loses its memory. The second thing that happens is that a state education system comes into place in which religion has no role and which effectively teaches uniformity. And the third thing he speaks about is that in the public discourse, only one view is actually articulated, a secularist view. And when you look at our country at the moment, what I'm suggesting to you is that it is deeply caught in this ideological colonization. There is an erasure, a deliberate and sustained erasure of our memory as a Christian people. Secondly, in our schools, while we say we have Catholic schools or Church of Ireland schools or different denominational schools or vocational schools, in truth we really have vocational schools. In truth, when we have education in our schools, particularly in what we call Catholic schools, there's an embarrassment to actually teach Catholic teaching, and indeed that is a major problem in Church of Ireland schools as well. And in truth, when we look at our public square and in our political discourse, no politician seriously and repeatedly can speak about basing his or her judgments on a God-given perspective without being the subject of sustained ridicule. These are facts, and that constitutes ideological colonization, the erasure of memory, an anodyne schooling system, and a loss of vision in public life. And this is why, by way of conclusion, the three persons of the Trinity are so important, because they offer the antidote to that colonization. They offer through the idea of preserving and protecting our memory as a people. They offer through the Son the importance of dignity of the human person, particularly in education. And they offer through the Holy Spirit the importance of vision and inspiration in how people engage in public life. And if I can finish by simply putting this final idea before you, which is this, that returning to that quotation of Roger Scruton, which is, as I said at the beginning, we must strive to be worthy of an inheritance that we did not create and to amend it only when we have first understood it. And what I want to finish by saying to you is this, is that when anyone suggests removing the Trinity from the Constitution, the question has to be asked, what is the more beautiful, the more worthy, the more glorious vision that they want to put in its place? What is the substitute going to be? What is the more attractive and beautiful vision of reality that you want to substitute from the Trinity? And invariably what we find is that when people suggest this, whether they're right or they're wrong, the actual reflection on what the Trinity means can often be very superficial. And what I'm simply suggesting to you, and I want to leave you with this, is that the Trinity is not understood and is not an effort to understand the Trinity, just as indeed the meaning of the centrality of Jesus Christ is not understood. And I simply want to conclude by suggesting that let us try to understand them better, to reflect upon them further before we jettison them from our Constitution for other formulas of words which are temporal, anodyne, inferior, and ultimately meaningless. Thank you.
Well, there were insights there on a broad canvas painted, and I think lots of food for thought. Just at this stage, could I suggest to people, really as to keep things moving at the same time, if you've any ideas in terms of questions, maybe you just give your name and a brief summary of what your question might be to Brendan, just to keep things moving. Our next speaker, Liam Herrick, is the Executive Director of the Irish Council of Civil Liberties. He has been an advisor to President D. Higgins. He was Executive Director of the Irish Penal Reform Trust. He was the first head of legislation and policy at the former Irish Human Rights Commission and the Law Reform Commission, and he's with the Department of Foreign Affairs. He's a former member of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, a former board member of the Children's Rights Alliance. He's worked with the Minister of Justice on the Equality Strategic Review Group on Penal Policy. He graduated from UCC with a BCL and an LLM, and from University College Dublin with a diploma in human rights law. So once again, particularly Liam and David, they're here as our visitors. They've taken time and they are giving us of their insights. Many thanks.
Thank you, James. The introduction was probably a bit excessive, but I'm very flattered, and it's great to be here today. First, I want to commend Patrick on what was a very elegant and artful presentation. This won't be that, I'm afraid, but I would hope to maybe respond to some of the points that he made and maybe introduce some ideas and suggestions. I think it's an interesting topic. for a number of reasons. The first of which I think is it makes us think about a provision in the Constitution, or whether it's provision or not, a part of the Constitution that doesn't get much judicial attention. It is, the preamble has been referred to in case law on occasion, and it does seem to have had some legal potency. It has had some influence, particularly when it was used in some cases dealing with the question of religion or related areas. But if we want to think about what the purpose of it is, what function it might serve, it first of all establishes the authority of the Constitution. And the preceding Constitution of the Free State articulated a different authority. That Constitution was introduced by the Oireachtas. Its authority, its Grundnorm in jurisprudential terms, came from the Parliament and ultimately from the Treaty of 1921 and ultimately from legislation passed in Westminster. The 1937 Constitution very deliberately and consciously set out to identify a different source of authority for our law and our system of government in the country in which we live in. And it effectively does it in two ways. The more important provision, I would say, is that we, the people of Ireland, enact this constitution. It is a republican constitution that was approved by the people at a popular vote. And that is why the authority for our system of government here lies with us, the people that live in this country, the citizens of this country. In that context, the reference to the Trinity, to one particular religious tradition, is somewhat in tension with the idea of a republican political entity. And I think when we look at Patrick's suggestion about memory and history, that it's somehow linking to an authentic history, I would question that. I mean, certainly, of course, there's no doubt whatsoever that the Christian tradition and indeed some of the aspects which Patrick referred to have played a very significant role in making this country what it is today in the history of this nation. But it's not the whole story. And in fact, when you look at the text, there's inherent contradictions even in the way in which it's expressed in the preamble. They talk of humbly acknowledging all our obligations to our divine Lord Jesus Christ, who sustained our fathers through centuries of trial. I mean, our Lord Jesus Christ also sustained the people that were imposing those trials on the people of Ireland through those years. And they claimed Christian authority for the suppression of Catholics, particularly dissenters and those of non-religion in this country, just the same way as the founders of the state sought the Catholic tradition to justify the revolutionary movement. And of course, De Valera himself would very much have seen the purpose of the Constitution in that tradition. And there has always been a non-Christian tradition in Irish history. If we wish to go back to our forefathers, and we can go back to the 6th century and the 8th century, and we can go back before that, to the period in this country where we had historical origins that was influenced by other sources, and indeed, whether it be the Vikings, whether it be Jewish population in this country for up to 1,000 years, and others that always were dissenters or outside of that tradition, our history is more rich. And when we talk about what the function of a preamble is, we need to ask ourselves if its purpose is to unify the totality of the political community, or if it is to divide, and if it is to be exclusionary of others. So I'll come back in the end to the very specific political question about unity and division that we face on this island today. I think it is interesting to contrast the language of the preamble, which James read out earlier, with the language of the proclamation, which famously talks about cherishing all the children of the nation equally. And specifically with the reference to the different Christian traditions, that's certainly true, but it clearly had an ambition beyond that too. Now, there's other parts of the preamble which do make, or the proclamation, which make reference to God. So, they were clearly coming from a tradition as well. But I think that brings us to the question about whether a document that was written in 1916 or a document that was written in 1922 or the document that was written in 1937, however authentic or representative it was of the country at that time, and I would certainly question that, we need to think about a very different Ireland today. There was reference made by Patrick to the Progressive Democrats' proposal to remove all references to God in the Constitution in the 1980s, and a hostile reaction to that at that point. Well, I think we all recognise, and I'm sure my friends will recognise too, that whatever about the 1980s, the Ireland of 2022 is a very different place in a number of respects. We are now a more diverse country, which has much greater religious diversity, both in terms particularly of the membership of our political community and our citizenship of people of non-Christian or non-Judeo-Christian religions, and of course a very significant proportion of our population that espouse no religion. That does not mean that they don't care about dignity, doesn't mean that they don't have values, it doesn't mean that they don't have strong views about the type of political community in which we wish to live, but it does mean that the language of the Holy Trinity is alien and exclusionary to them. And I would strongly dispute, I think, the argument that Patrick makes about either dignity or indeed the assertion that the tradition of human rights is predominantly or solely linked to a Christian or Judeo-Christian tradition. I don't believe that's historically accurate. I mean, if you look at the process by which the United Nations, in the period after the Second World War, formulated and agreed the document that would become the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there were clear inputs and influences by people from the Islamic tradition, the Hinduist tradition, and also from an atheist and humanist position, including communists and socialists. There are clear traces in Christian theology and Christian philosophy. Absolutely, it's clear there. There's a rich tradition which is reflected, but there are others that are reflected as well. So, if we were to abandon the influence of one particular philosophical tradition, or if I would say we were to unify with others, where might we look for sources? Well, this is a contradiction in the Constitution, because in the Constitution itself, it actually articulates other sources of philosophical influence. We have the directive principles of social policy in Article 45, which have been neglected almost as much as the preamble has been. But they go far beyond theological, narrow Christian tradition as espoused in the preamble, and draw in a wider set of influences, certainly drawn from Catholic social teaching, but I think going beyond that as well, and particularly in terms of Republican political thought. We, of course, also have what's happened in the period since 1937. And most significantly, I would argue, predictably enough, that the development of international human rights law by the United Nations, by the Council of Europe, and by the European Union and other bodies in the period since 1945, bodies of which Ireland has played a very active and prominent part, should at least inform our understanding today. And in fact, as the Constitution has evolved, as we have incorporated international treaties into Irish law, and as we have inserted a provision into our constitutional text which gives the primary authority of European law, or superior authority of European law over Irish law, the value system has also shifted and changed, reflecting an evolution of the country in which we live. I think that there is probably, I mean, this debate in a way is might seem like an abstract debate, in that the Constitution Review Group, as has been pointed out earlier, reflected on this question. It did recommend replacing the text that was there, which clearly doesn't reflect a system of beliefs that is enjoyed by all of the community, or perhaps even most of the community that live in this country today, and clearly a reference to one specific Christian tradition in a country that is diverse is not appropriate. I think most people would agree with that. There is a question though, but is this just an abstract question, or should we bother engaging with it now? And I would suggest that actually it perhaps isn't such an abstract question anymore. I mean, nothing has happened really on this question since 1999. There's no political appetite. None of the parties today are really pushing for this. There's more important and urgent political questions. But it is likely that there's going to be a very urgent and immediate political question in the years facing us in the future. And that relates particularly to the question not of the unity and diversity of the political community in this part of the island, but the unity and community that goes beyond this part of the island. And the potential that we're going to face constitutional questions and challenges in the years to come about the potential unification of the island. Now, it may be within the next 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, but I think there's a growing awareness that this is something that we are all going to have to reflect on in a much deeper way. And if we are to do so, that might create the practical political imperative for looking at parts of our constitution and our national emblems and symbols that are divisive or exclusionary, and seek instead to replace them with that which might be unifying. This is the question I think that Patrick left with us at the end, is that the challenge of replacing may not be a straightforward or simple one. It may be difficult to find a substitute that is as rich or as informative as what we've had already. And I suppose I'm ambitious in that respect, that I don't think it's beyond us. What we've seen with constitution-making processes in different parts of the world is that context is everything. If you seek to develop or draft a constitution in a time of conflict, very often the outcomes can be unsuccessful. But if you try to do them in times when you're trying to reimagine in a creative way to create something that's much more unifying than that's what's preceded it, and we're thinking in particular of the example of the South African constitution in the post-democratic period, I think political entities such as ours can show great imagination. And I would be ambitious that we could seek to replace this narrow exclusionary text with something that is more ambitious and does reflect the traditions which we have, but in an inclusive manner. So yes, it would be completely appropriate to make reference to the influence of the Christian tradition on our history, but we need to engage very much with the history of division and strife on this island. And that's what the Constitution Review Group said in 1999. They talked about the function and the purpose being here to find something that would avoid divisiveness and recognise instead the diversity of traditions, ideals and aspirations. And I think that should be our starting point. And I would end perhaps on the beauty of the form of the preamble, whereas I wouldn't accept the appropriateness of its content. The form of the preamble talks about values of the common good, justice, prudence, and charity. Concepts that I would say are truly unifying. Concepts that also find reflection in the text of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And what you see in the judicial references to the preamble by Judge Walsh in McGee, Chief Justice O'Higgins in Healy-Donoghue, is they talked about how this language actually gives an authority for the judges of our courts to interpret the Constitution as a living document that grows and moves with the values of their time. And that is, I suppose, it gave them an authority to do what they did in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and so on. So I think we can take the good from that. The structure is sound. But I think that we have an opportunity now to reimagine a set of values that is much more inclusive than what's there before. So I think this might be a useful exercise, but I would suggest as part of a wider conversation about reimagining our Constitution in a broader sense. And I don't want to take the time now, but I mean, we talk about the preamble. There are other exclusionary elements of the Constitution, particularly the provisions with regard to religious oaths for certain state official positions, which would, I think, logically follow from this as well. But I look forward to any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Liam. once again, great thoughts, a polished performance, food for thought. Our last speaker, David Quinn, he's the director of the Iona Institute. He's a journalist and he specialises in religious and social affairs. He currently has columns in the Sunday Times and the Irish Catholic, and I think you're all familiar with him. In terms of his function as director of the Iona Institute, he represents the Institute publicly and he runs and coordinates its various projects and undertakings. And just before I speak, could I just remind you again, any questions, if you just notify us as best you can. Many thanks. David.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Liam, and thank you for all being here. I was given the chance to speak first, and I should have said yes, because some of the things I'm going to say, actually, Patrick has already anticipated, but that's how it goes. So I suppose my position is kind of about 80% of the way towards Patrick, which probably won't surprise you. Slightly different about how the preamble should go in the future. But I'm going to start by quoting Martin Luther King and his letter from Birmingham jail in April 1963. So he's in prison because he's broken the law. So he's contemplating the nature of law. So he asks the question, how does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? And he answers, a just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. Now, Martin Luther King obviously believed in God. He was a Lutheran minister, and all of his speeches and addresses are just full of biblical language and carried great resonances from the Bible. Now, if Martin Luther King read the preamble to the Irish Constitution, what would he think? He's not a Catholic. So would he see it as particularly, Catholic sectarian? And the answer is obviously not, because the Holy Trinity, the belief in that is something that unites all Christians. So I think he would probably agree with every word of the preamble from a philosophical point of view. And as I say, he writes this in April 1963, so 59 years ago. And America was and is a republic which refuses to establish any particular religion. But would Luther support our preamble being part of the Constitution? Because while he may agree with it philosophically, he might think the Constitution is not the place for that. And I don't know what the answer to that question is. So he might have agreed with his worldview, but at the same time believed that the Constitution of a country should not be so overtly and explicitly Christian. Now, I personally think an argument can be made for altering the preamble to reflect the fact that the Irish society we now live in is far more multicultural and secular than it was in 1927, so that some of the direct invocations of Christianity could be removed. In fact, given how very secular and sometimes aggressively secular Ireland can sometimes be, and some of the very dramatic changes in law, I'm thinking, for example, of the 2018 referendum on abortion that have taken place in the last few years, maybe the pretense that the Irish state, which is what the preamble says, so it pretends that the Irish state is somehow under the authority of the Trinity, which obviously as Christians we ultimately believe, but should the preamble believe it where we now are? Because obviously the state itself no longer believes it is under the authority of the Trinity, does it? I mean, it just doesn't. And many Irish people don't believe that either. So in a sense, from a Christian point of view, maybe a change to the preamble is almost required, because the changes are now so dramatic, and Irish society has changed so dramatically that it's simply a pretense to pretend that Irish society thinks it is under the authority of the Trinity and that the Irish state is under the authority of the Trinity. However, the preamble at least raises the extremely important question of who or what is the ultimate source of law. Because we've still got to answer that question. What is the ultimate source of law? So we might say the people, pluralist, secular, republic might say the people. But what happens if the people throw their weight behind something that would appear clearly unjust to someone like Martin Luther King? Would it be good enough to turn around and say, well, this is what a majority want, the people are ultimate, and the people are the ultimate arbiters of what's a just law? And it is not to question democracy, by the way, or anything. It's just to say that, you know, even in a democracy where a majority have voted for something, we're still able to say what you voted for is unjust. But what gives us the right to say it's unjust? What is the higher thing we're appealing to that allows us to say that 60, 70, 80, 90, 99% of the people have just passed an unjust law? Now, Martin Luther King would give a very clear answer to that question. But what does somebody who believes the people are ultimate say about that? Why could you say the people have just passed an unjust law? I think some secularists have difficulty answering this question, ultimately, for reasons I'll go into. The American Declaration of Independence says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, all people," it's the language they'd use now, I'm sure, "are created equal." So we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Now that's not the Constitution, it's the Declaration of Independence. So the same, we're all created equal, therefore created, which means by God. We just don't come from the universe. And we hold these truths to be self-evident, which might be something you could have said in 1776, but I'm not sure you can say it now, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So are these truths self-evident? Again, a lot of people say no. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche would have said these are absolutely not self-evident truths, not at all. And there's plenty of other philosophers who would agree with him. So we might point to something like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but this actually is essentially a Christian democratic document. I know other parties had input to it, but Samuel Moyne, who's been mentioned by Patrick already, and Samuel Moyne, he's a legal scholar of considerable weight and authority, not a Christian, and he has a book called Christian Human Rights, very slim volume, quite dense. You think you're going to read it quickly, and this turns out not to be the case, not for me anyway. So the Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is absolutely suffused with natural law, thinking that we have natural rights that belong to us simply because we're human beings. So thinkers like Charles Malik and Jacques Maritain, both Christians, Malik was a Lebanese Christian, they had a massive influence upon the document and they believed deeply in natural law. Malik said in 1951, "In Christianity, the individual person possesses an absolute value. The ultimate ground of all our freedom is the Christian doctrine of the absolute inviolability of the human person." Now, why do Christians believe in this? The answer is, we believe we are made in the image and likeness of God. So no matter how low-born or high-born we are in the social strata, we are all absolutely morally equal. So it doesn't matter if you're the peasant or the king, absolutely morally equal. But why do we believe this? Because again, we're made in the image and likeness of God. We have not come from nothing, as materialists would believe, that is, people who believe matter is all there is. Patrick has also said this. Moyne in his book points out human dignity in its modern form is properly set out for the first time by Pius XII in World War II. I don't know if that's true, what Moyne says. And the Irish Constitution is the first written constitution in which dignity features. Now, it might be responded, the modern idea of human rights doesn't come from Christianity at all. How can it? Because Christianity or the Christian community is responsible for so many crimes and is so often sided with oppressive regimes, which is 100% true. I wish I could remember his name. There was a thinker who said Jesus came to give us the kingdom of heaven and instead we got the church. All right, now there's a certain amount of truth in that, but actually what we got was sinful human nature. The Preamble to the French Constitution of 1958 explicitly says, "The French people solemnly proclaim their attachment to the rights of man as defined by the Declaration of 1789, which is the year of the French Revolution." But Luc Ferry, he's a French philosopher, former government minister, a non-Christian. He's a book called A Brief History of Thought. It's about 10 years old. So he talks about the rights of man. And he says, 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man owes to Christianity an essential part of his egalitarian message. Now, in his book, Ferry goes through all the influences upon Western thought and how we are the way we are. So he goes through Rome, he goes through Greece, and ancient Greece. He goes right through it. But he says the Greeks and the Romans did not believe we're all created morally equal. Far from it. They believed, for example, Aristotle believed some people are naturally slaves. And in fact, Patrick was talking about Dennis Casas, who's fighting for the rights of South Americans and so on, not to be enslaved. And the defenders of slavery, now Christians have also defended slavery. I mean, it's an incredibly complicated story. But the people who said we can enslave them were quoting Aristotle, that some people are naturally made for slavery and some people are naturally made to rule. But how can it be that the Declaration of the Rights of Man owes anything to Christianity? Wasn't the French Revolution in part a revolt against the church because it got so allied to the Ancien regime, which is true. But as Ferry also has the honesty to admit, the idea of the equal dignity of all human beings makes its first appearance with Christianity. This is simply a flat-out fact in this part of the world. Ferry also says, we see today how civilizations that have not experienced Christianity have great difficulty in fostering democratic regimes because the notion of equality, that is the moral equality of all human beings, is not so deeply rooted. This thesis is strongly reinforced by a book called The Weirdest People in the World by a Harvard anthropologist named Joseph Herrick, an atheist. Weird stands for Western, educated, industrial, rich, democratic. And in world terms, Westerners are weird because our culture has become so highly individualistic. Henrik says in his book, historically societies have been clan-based. You're born into a clan, you've got your obligations to the clan, your place in life is set by the clan will also look after you, but individual freedom doesn't really come into it. And historically, most societies have been clan and tribe-based. The Catholic Church, Christianity comes along and says, actually, you shouldn't be marrying your cousins. It's the basis of clans. So this all begins to break up. This is all really, really fantastically set out by Henrik in his book. I don't have time to go into it. It's a book that is so incredibly rewarding to read. Even The Guardian, champion of secularism, strong anti-clerical tradition, acknowledges that the idea of the moral equality of all human beings comes from Christianity. So an editorial a few years ago, reflecting on the decline of Christianity and Christian practice in Britain, says, a post-Christian Europe will of course have a morality, but it won't be Christian morality. It will be less universalist, meaning Christianity says everybody is my brother and sister. It will be less universalist. The idea that people have some rights just because they are human and entirely irrespective of merit certainly isn't derived from observation of the world, because the world is full of natural inequalities, right? Absolutely full of natural inequalities. So this is The Guardian. It arose out of Christianity, no matter how much Christians have in practice resisted it. Although human rights have become embedded in our institutions at the same time as religious observance has been in decline, they could become vulnerable in an entirely post-Christian environment where the collective memory slips from the old moorings inherited from Christian ethics. That is the idea that we're all created morally equal. So never mind natural inequalities. We're created morally equal, 100% equal and infinite moral worth. So this theme that The Guardian, secular paper, discusses is extremely well developed by Tom Holland in Dominion. He's not a Christian. He's kind of a Christian-friendly agnostic. And by Larry Seatentop in an even better book, former Oxford Don, called Inventing the Individual. A superb book. Neither of these writers is Christian, but they say so much goes back to this belief we're all created morally equal. Where does that come from if you're simply a materialist? The universe doesn't say we're morally equal. So what I'm saying is our idea of human rights is rooted in a Christian view of the infinite and equal worth of all human beings to an extent we barely see anymore and sometimes outright reject. So these writers say this and acknowledge it even though none of them are Christians. Yuval Noah Harari, he's the author of this kind of best-selling book called Sapiens, one of these kind of big idea books. He's an atheist. He says, the liberal belief in the free and sacred nature of each individual is a direct legacy of the traditional Christian belief in free and eternal individual souls. without recourse to eternal souls and a creator God, key here, it becomes embarrassingly difficult to explain what is so special about individual sapiens. In other words, we simply come out of a universe essentially from nowhere, completely cold, blank, impersonal universe. What's so special about humans that they have rights, inherent rights? Okay, not rights that's given to us by someone. They're inherent in us as human beings. Okay, so we say it's because we're created in the image and likeness of God. Somebody else says because we're humans. Well, the universe doesn't think there's anything special about that. We might think we're special, but what's that based on? Just a notion. It's actually a metaphysical fiction, if all you believe in is the material universe. Harari adds, like liberal humanism, socialist humanism is built on monotheist foundations. The idea that all humans are equal is a revamped version of the monotheist convictions that all souls are equal before God. So Harari is an atheist. There's nothing but matter. He doesn't believe in free will either, by the way. He says everything is controlled by physical laws, including our thoughts. So where does this leave us? It means, I think, that any future preamble has to grapple with the idea of what human rights are based on and where they come from. What's the ultimate grounding of law? If it's just us, we're making it up. It's invented. We might come to a consensus. Okay, we might have a social contract, but it can change overnight, and nobody can then turn around and say, "You've violated my inherent dignity. Okay, you've taken away my inalienable rights," which you can't do because that means you can't take them away. Okay, because I'm a human being, and somebody says, "Well, I don't care. It doesn't matter." All right, humans actually have no inherent rights because we come from a blank and impersonal universe. And this is what people like Harari and Nietzsche and the other writers I've been talking about believe. So we can't simply hand wave away the debate and not decide what is the ultimate source of human rights and assume certain things are self-evident, like the Declaration of Independence did, although the writers of that, even though they were often deists, did believe in God. At an absolute minimum, nearly finished, any new preamble would have to acknowledge a Christian heritage, which the European Union point-blank failed to do, refused to do, in its preamble to its now abandoned constitution. It did speak of Europe's spiritual and moral heritage and how the Union is founded on the indivisible universal values of human dignity, freedom, equality and solidarity. But it did not properly consider where these notions ultimately spring from, which is an act of total historical and philosophical amnesia. In my view, a mature country confronts these questions and answers them honestly. What is the ultimate source of law? So a good place to start for any such discussion, no matter what we do with the preamble, is the preamble. The preamble should consider what is the ultimate source of law. And even if we come up with something like the French preamble to the Constitution, we believe in the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Where do the rights of man come from? Said Luke Ferry thinks they come ultimately from the Christian belief. We're all made in the image and likeness of God. Thank you.
Thank you, David. It just gets better. I mean, the gems that are thrown out to you, to think it is wonderful. Top table here, we've one lawyer and two other people. All I can say is thank God the other two don't practice law, because if the mental agility which they have, I wouldn't like to be up against them, and if people like them were practicing law, I'd starve. So anyway, any questions, please?
I was wondering, for Liam, like the source of, just to pick up on David's last point, that where do you start?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Brendan. I mean, I found David's argument very interesting. My immediate response is, even if all of that is true, and some of it's disputed, but he put together a very compelling, I think it's probably fine, even if it is true that the content of human rights comes predominantly from the Judeo-Christian tradition, if we accept that for a second, then why would we feel a need to claim that ownership
and express it in an exclusionary way in a legal text? Why would it not be enough for us to say, we're proud of the fact as Christians that the content of our value system for our political entity comes to a large extent from our belief, and we believe actually it's almost exclusively from that? Why would we feel the need then to go further and express that tradition in an exclusionary way? It's an offensive idea to somebody like me that is an atheist, who believes very profoundly in the principles of human dignity and in principles of human rights, to say that unless I, at a spiritual level, have a Christian belief, that it's not possible to formulate or come to that view. And it's even more offensive to political entities in parts of this world that have not had a Judeo-Christian tradition, to suggest that they can't also organise themselves around a value system that's based on human dignity and human rights. In fact, to suggest, I think, the logical conclusion of David's argument that this can only come from the Judeo-Christian tradition, or that's where it comes from, is, I would suggest, perhaps a little colonial. And the argument that the secular tradition is exclusionary, colonial, or homogenous stands somewhat in contrast with the lived experience of Christian colonialism in every part of the world for shine 1,000 years. So I think that I'm willing to go a long way down the road of accepting what David is saying about the philosophical tradition, but it's a huge leap then to feel a need to politically or legally claim ownership in such an exclusionary way. I think we can all have our interpretations of the history of philosophy, and it's very interesting as an academic exercise, but it's not appropriate to translate that into a legal or political document.
Okay, so I actually want the preamble to change, so I don't want it to be exclusionary. In terms of the moral equality of all human beings, if you believe we're created by God, so you don't have to be Christian to believe, obviously, we're created by God. Can you all hear me? So you can believe in a non-Christian God and still believe we're all created morally equal. You see, I still don't know how the person who doesn't believe in God believes we're all morally equal and of infinite worth when we come from nothing and are going nowhere. All right? We're the kind of chance products that arose between two ice ages. Okay? As another atheist, by the way, has put it. There's a guy called Alex Rosenberg, an atheist. He's written a book called The Atheist Guide to Reality, Living Your Life Without Illusions. And he says there's no objective right and wrong because the universe doesn't produce it. There's no free will because we're completely governed by physical laws. Physical laws explain and control everything, including our thoughts. So there's no part of us that can be free of physical laws, so he rejects free will. There is no meaning, there is no purpose. So these are atheists. So Christianity has bequeathed to us, despite the undoubted crimes of Christianity down to 2,000 years, and by the way, the undoubted crimes of the human race in general, okay, because the sins of the human race don't surprise anyone, certainly don't surprise Christians. If we become incredibly forgetful over time of Christianity and kind of take for granted the moral inheritance, and over time we move towards an incredibly more technocratic view of life, a utilitarian view of life, all right? And belief in God just continues to fade into the background. This is what the Guardian leader is driving at. Then you simply cannot take for granted the idea that we all believe we're created morally equal, or simply morally equal. You can't take for granted that will survive. It could easily disappear. Easily.
I mean, I think it is interesting to hear David talk about religious belief and secular belief as two opposites that are irreconcilable, and that one must be absolutely in one camp or another. It's also interesting to hear David, who works for an organisation that is about the advancement of religion, and I understand that, to be so concerned about defining what atheism is what atheists can believe in moral values and can't.
I'm quoting atheist, though.
Well, you are, but, I mean, I'm an atheist. I don't seek to in any way limit or define the multiplicity of religious beliefs in terms of their moral value or not. In fact, freedom of religion is one of the most fundamental human rights, the right of people to express and hold whichever religious belief that they choose. But I would never in any circumstance suggest that for a philosophical reason I don't believe a Christian person can do X, Y, or Z, or believe X, Y, and Z. In the same way that David clearly does believe that he doesn't understand or doesn't recognize the validity of atheists having those views. And I believe that there are many atheists in every part of the world, in every political and social tradition, that have played a hugely valuable role in advancing the cause of humanism, equality, and compassion. And I think we don't need to name who they are, that they're well recognized, that we're able to manage to do so without the crutch of any theological religion. So I think it comes back to the idea that we're seeking to find a way of being inclusive of those of all creeds and none, rather than feeling a need that one side of a false binary has the exclusive market on truth.
If I might, could I just respond? Maybe this is a private debate and I shouldn't be participating, but if I could just make one reflection on that, which is this, that one of the remaining leading academic philosophers in the world in politics, and he's 92 years of age, is Alistair MacIntyre, who's now, for the end of his professional life, has been based in Notre Dame University in Illinois. And I listened to a lecture he gave in Notre Dame last November, and in the course of it, to my amazement, when he was talking about the concept of human dignity, about 3/4 of the way into his address, which was the keynote address, he started talking about the Irish Constitution and the battle that Noel Browne had with the Catholic Church in 1951 and with the then Archbishop John Charles McQuaid. And what he said was, which was fascinating, he said that it is a regular habit of mine, he said, that when I discuss any issue of political philosophy, I always return to the Irish context and the Irish Constitution. Now, his background, of course, is as a Scot. And what struck me about that, and which I see reflected in the clarity with which Liam and David discussed this point, is that there is something particularly significant about the Irish Constitution. And these issues in relation to constitutional law are particularly febrile in this country. One could argue that in Palestine, issues of religion and religious identity crystallize in that part of the world. But issues of constitutional law and Western political identity seem to crystallize in this small country of ours. And what that leads me on to say is as follows, that listening to Liam and listening to David, I actually agree with both of them. And the question is, how can you agree with both of them? And the reason you can agree with both of them is that they're both talking about two different things. What Liam is talking about, in my view, is that he's talking about the role of a preamble in terms of identity. And it is irrefutable that if we leave the preamble the way it is exclusionary. It's massively exclusionary to a person of an atheist perspective, of any person who doesn't come from a Christian denomination, or to a person who is secularist. But the function of the preamble in the Constitution as it is currently drafted is not one of identity. It's not one of inclusion. It's not one of democratically representing all the different belief systems in this country. The purpose of the preamble is exactly what David says it is, which is to define where authority in the Constitution comes from. It's not identity, it's authority. So fundamentally you have to ask yourself, if we remove reference to the Trinity and to the Christian expression of Trinity, where are we saying that the authority, or to use Liam's term coming from Hans Kelsen, where does the Grundnorm come from? What is the source of law? And the reason why human rights are so important in this context is that, again, Liam is completely correct when he says that the framers of the 1948 Declaration, leaving aside Charles Mallock, leaving aside Eleanor Roosevelt, leaving aside Jacques Maritain. Of course there were other non-Christian influences, but it isn't about identity, it's about where do you say a human right comes from? Where is the authority for a human right? And the only way that can come is a formula used by Professor Joseph Rice, who's the son of Charles Rice, who's lecturing in Seton Hall University in the States, is what he calls the dignity formula. And the dignity formula he derives from John 13:3, and I just want to read this to you and finish with this. He says, John 13:3 says, Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So human dignity and a human right comes from this belief that not only we're made in the image and likeness of God, but each human person comes from God and returns to God. And if you remove God as the authority, you are inescapably left in a political vacuum of relativism, where there is no grundnorm or deeper authority which prevents infringement of human dignity and rights.
I mean, I'll just say briefly, so if there's no God, we obviously don't get our rights from God. The universe clearly doesn't give us our rights. The universe is cold, impersonal, and blank. It doesn't know we exist. The universe doesn't give us our rights. God doesn't give us our rights if there's no God. So we could say humans give each other our rights, and that means they're invented.
None of you have established that the preamble is necessary in the first instance. If we compare to legislation, my understanding of the preamble is to effectively explain the purpose of the legislature in introducing the law. So if we take a purposive approach to the preamble is there to explain the purpose or function of the document. So if it's merely purpose or function, why is there any, I suppose, necessity to state anything other than its intent or its purpose or functionality? That's the first question. The second question is, does our constitutional tradition not firmly and fundamentally come from the Anglo-American tradition? And if we look at the preeminent constitutional document, which is the American Constitution, there is no reference to God in that document. And it can't be vouchsafed or doubted but that the authors and framers of that constitution fall very much within that Judeo-Christian context, if you want to use that phraseology. And their reference, the framers of the American Constitution, their 90-word preamble, reference liberty as being the foundation from which these rights derive. And so perhaps you might comment on that.
Patrick?
Well, just to say, Sean, thank you for that. 2 points. The first point I hope we sort of have addressed, which is that the purpose of the preamble, as it is stated, is to state from where authority emerges. It's a statement of the source of authority, not a statement of our collective identity. So it's a question of whether you believe a constitutional document should have a preface which effectively says what is the basis for the authority of the provisions in the Constitution and legislation that is enacted in accordance with its provisions. But in terms of functionality, separate to actually giving authority, I believe fundamentally that Christian tradition, particularly whether reformist or Catholic, has never been properly explained. It just hasn't been explained to any of us, and that it's something that you have to spend your life searching out. So the difficulty we have is that I believe that it has an enormous functionality in terms of setting forth or prompting us to look at an incomparably beatific vision of life, of human life, of collective life. But the problem is none of us are educated or schooled in that through the way we've actually been educated in faith. The second point about the Anglo-American tradition is simply this, that of course you have to be correct that that's coming from a Western colonial and Judeo-Christian heritage. But ultimately, well, as my understanding, and it's a very superficial understanding of who De Valera consulted with, at the time of the formulation of the Irish Constitution, and obviously the head of Blackrock College was a key person who he consulted with. But he did consult with a range of different Christian denominations, predominantly, if not exclusively. And effectively, the preamble of the Constitution, as I see it, was very much a statement of the Christian heritage of Ireland, fundamentally articulating Catholic social doctrine through the rights provisions of 40 to 44. So it would strike me that it comes from, because of its specific emphasis on Catholic social doctrine, it does come from quite a markedly different tradition to the Anglo-American tradition.
David, any comments? Liam?
I would agree with the point that the preamble should be functional, it should have a function. And I think that it actually, as I said at the beginning, has actually provided a very useful function. I mean, the Bunrock has performed largely very, very well for a document from 1937. I think as probably everybody here agrees. And I think one of the elements in that is the way in which the preamble sets out values at a high level, philosophical values at a high level, that were used as guidance for our judges to interpret the Constitution in an evolving way over time. In contrast, for example, you refer to the United States, the way in which, sadly I would say in the United States, this pretty philosophically poor idea of an originalist interpretation has emerged, where the idea is that you interpret the American Constitution in terms of the social reality of the late 18th century and the very small number of people and the small number of traditions that lived there at that time. The Irish Constitution was interpreted a different way, and the preamble articulates a way in which that can be done. So I just think it comes down to how we think about ideas and values, and whether we think of them that are part of the rich heritage of all humanity, and that they can be interpreted and used in different ways at different times by everybody, with a belief that's based in true universalism, that everybody has rights and everybody has a right to the intellectual heritage that we have inherited. Or if you think ideas are things that have to be branded and owned by some sections of society to the exclusion of others. So I think if you take out the references to Trinity and God in the preamble, and you instead say that the authority resides in the people who take political ownership themselves, because that's what republicanism is, and then think, having a national conversation about what values we wish to say. And I would say that a lot of what's in the preamble we would retain, the ideas of justice and charity and prudence and so on, but we might expand it to have a more inclusive sense today.
I have time for one more question.
There's a short and concise answer to that question, is that the drafters in 1937 didn't have the benefit of the body of international human rights law, which was agreed by consensus by the community of the world in the decades that followed from that. And today we do have that, which is influenced by the tradition that's been articulated here. So I think we do have sources of higher law that are human-made, albeit inspired by philosophical and religious tradition, which I think do provide a grounding. And human rights law was developed for exactly the purpose that you suggest. In the aftermath of what we saw in the Second World War, there was a view that national legal systems couldn't be trusted to maintain a level of values in the throes of political turmoil and conflict, as we saw. So a set of higher international laws were set. And I think that that has served us broadly very well.
I'm afraid I have to finish with that. I'm under strict instructions to finish at 6. And I believe Sandro has to say a few words.
So, would you join with me to show appreciation for our speakers, for Mr. Liam Herrick, Irish Council for Civil Liberties, Mr. Patrick Treacy, Bar of Ireland, Mr. David Quinn, Iona Institute, and our chair this afternoon, Mr. James Doran, Bar of Ireland,